Awesome. Sounds great. So, hey, everybody, we're going to talk about WordPress and how we can scale it with Next.js. So, who am I? I know we had that wonderful introduction, but I'm the one hugging BB-8 and Kylo Ren over there. I'm Colby Fayok. I work with the dev community as a developer advocate with Applitools. You can find me pretty much anywhere on the web by just Googling my name, as I'm the only one in the world. So let's start off by addressing the CMS in the room. It's 2021, and some developers would probably cringe at the thought of WordPress, but frankly, we're still living in a WordPress world. According to Build with Trends, if we look at the CMS distribution of the top 1 million sites, 40% of websites are using WordPress. That's a huge percentage. And I'm not quite sure how accurate this number is and how they derived it, but if you look at the number of detections on the BuiltWith site, it's over 800 million installs of WordPress. That's an absolutely staggering number. While we might not all want to use WordPress, it's realistically around to stay for the foreseeable future. So let's talk about how we can take advantage of the King CMS in a headless way and use it to power our Jamstack sites in 2021. So to start, what does headless actually mean? Well, with our traditional stack, somebody visits a page in their browser. The browser reaches out to the server will do the work like request data from the database, then render that HTML for the page and return a response. If we're lucky, it'll return it cached. And finally, the browser displays that response to the person. With a headless approach, that request is to the server is asynchronous on the client typically. In this particular example, the person would visit a page in their browser and immediately get a response straight from storage like AWS S3. Once the page loads in the browser will kick off another request to a server which can load in all the dynamic content. But I would imagine you'd be wondering, why would you want to make a client-side request to a CMS like WordPress? And that's not necessarily the recommended approach. That's where static site generators come in to do the hard lifting before your page even hits the browser, which has given rise to what people now call the Jamstack. Maybe you've heard of the Jamstack on Twitter, or maybe it's completely new, but what exactly is it? At the core of it, Jamstack sites are static HTML websites. This isn't a new idea, but it's a modern approach. Typically, they use JavaScript in the browser to make any request to your APIs that would provide dynamic data. Or they can use those APIs at compile time and serve that dynamic content without an extra client-side request. One example that we can imagine is building a React app. This would serve as our JavaScript layer. We would use the WordPress API to provide some content and dynamic data. We would then compile that down to a static site using something like Next.js, which, along with a ton of other features, is also a static site generator. Now, if this is all new to you, that sounds like a lot of work. Why not just use WordPress out of the box like we always do? Well, the great thing about the Jamstack sites is they have a lot of compelling features built right in. By default, we're living up to what AWS considers a well-architected infrastructure. These are features that we all care about, like performance, reliability, and cost. With most server-based solutions like WordPress, there are a lot of options to help speed things up. For WordPress specifically, that includes things like plugins to cache, or maybe even some custom work under the hood. But each page is a server hit, which is still prone to its ups and downs. On the other hand, serving a plain static HTML file is just going to be fast. Instead of spending that time rendering on the server, you serve a static file straight from storage or from a CDN. While you can do that with the default WordPress, it's often much more complicated, and some of the plugins that cache might serve an HTML file, but they still serve it from a regular server, not static storage. With any server, we're typically paying for how much we expect our traffic to be. While most of the time, that's pretty predictable. We all hope to one day have a post that goes viral, right? And if that happens, the people visiting our site are the ones that are going to be paying for it with slow speeds or timeouts. There's, of course, solutions like load balancing and auto scaling, but those aren't perfect solutions, and they might not always still handle a really big surge in traffic. Back to the fact that we're serving these static HTML files, because we're serving straight from storage, or better yet, serving them directly from a CDN, buzzword alert, that means that our user-facing website is going to infinitely scale. That static site will survive the Reddit hug of death when your post goes viral. Managing servers isn't always cheap. While a low traffic personal blog can manage a few dollars a month, the more that traffic grows, the more that the cost is going to quickly grow. While you have those options like load balancing and auto scaling, those services also quickly add up. And without it, you risk your site slowing down or worse, downtime. But storage is cheap. It's really cheap. We can maintain huge static projects on AWS using S3 for a really low cost. But even with the if we still manage server, the usage is going to be much lower with only content managers or requests at compile time. While there are a ton of headless options available, in a headless world, WordPress is still has a lot of features that makes it really compelling to use. One issue with a lot of the recent solutions is they seem to be developer focused. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you have to know your audience. If the ultimate goal is for that CMS to be used by people who are non technical, you're providing an experience that people might struggle to learn and use. WordPress is the most used CMS in the industry. That means that most of our clients are probably already going to be familiar with WordPress. And there's also a huge ecosystem already thriving around WordPress. If you run into an issue, you're more than likely able to find someone who already ran into that issue with a quick Google search. We can also take advantage of a lot of the community solutions that extend WordPress. All right, so if WordPress is so great, let's see what it actually looks like. Well, since 4.7, WordPress by default now supports a REST API. This means out of the box, WordPress is actually available as a headless API. But taking that a step further, thanks to Jason Ball, who created WP GraphQL, which is a plugin that we can add right inside of our dashboard, we also have the ability to query our WordPress data with GraphQL. So, coming full circle, we can take advantage of this approach where we leverage the APIs at compile time to produce static websites. Rather than waiting for a server request, we'll have our entire WordPress site available as HTML documents. And I've done just that with Next.js, which I've created a Next.js WordPress starter, which lets anyone spin up a new static WordPress site with React framework Next.js super easily. I've set this up so that on our homepage, when we're compiling the site, we're first going to reach out to get the first set of posts like we commonly would see on a WordPress blog site. Those are passed as props to the page that's built out React, which I can then use to create a UI just like I would with any other React app. Because Next.js won't know the routes ahead of time, I need to actually use dynamic routes. So we need to figure out all those pages that it actually needs to create. So we grab all the posts and we create new paths. And we're telling Next to create a new page for every single one. I also wanted to include client-side search for the project. The WordPress REST API provides search capabilities, but then we're going to still hit the server to do that. And since Next.js is built on top of Webpack, I was able to create a Webpack compiler that fetched all the posts at compile time. It would then create a search index with the titles and the paths and some metadata in a static file. It then loads that into memory or even asynchronously on the client, and then it makes the searches right to that index. And with all that, I was able to get together a WordPress site statically compiled with Next.js. The cool thing is we can couple this with WordPress plugins like Yoast and ACF, where we can give a lot of flexibility for managing our content. These work out of the box with Next.js WordPress Starter. So I know all of you don't want to just see some screenshots of some code, so let's do a quick walkthrough. So here's what I'm going to go through. I'm going to first show you how easy it is to spin up a new site with the Next.js starter. But that project is probably too much code to walk through today. So I'm going to spin up a second Next.js site, and I'm going to walk you through how that works from a simpler perspective. All right, so grab your popcorn. Let's get ready for the demo. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. So I'm going to start off with a pretty basic WordPress site. We can see here I'm inside WP Engine where I have my WordPress site pulled up. And just to prove that it's a pretty simple default installation, we can see here that under my posts, I have some post data. What I did was I used fillerama.io to fill in some content. It's nothing actually meaningful. It's just episode data from Futurama, if you're familiar. But if we go into things like the pages, we can see the same thing. I have an about us, or about and contact us page. And if we go to plugins, we can see that the only thing that I did here, and I actually should have deactivated this before the demo, but we can see that we have these plugins for a couple things. We have advanced custom fields, which I'll show you later, but we have WP GraphQL, which is primarily what we're going to be looking at today. So once we have that installed, the way we can install it in the first place is going up to our add new, where if we go over to search plugins, we can search for WP GraphQL. Oops. I don't know why it keeps hitting enter for me. There we go. So we can see that I already have this active, but this is the WP GraphQL plugin that you can install right inside of the WordPress dashboard. But what that does is it gives us this new GraphQL tab. And if I go inside of this graphical IDE, which if you're familiar with something like Gatsby, you might have already used the graphical IDE, which simply put is a really nice and easy way to query all of our data inside of WordPress. So instead of hitting that REST API, now what we can do is we can come over to this Explorer tab and we can see that if I go through here with the posts and the edges and the node, which this is referring to each of the different, basically an array of the data inside of my WordPress database. But we can see if I go down here, I can select things like, let me get rid of that since I already have it, but we can select things like my title and we have my URI, which let's click play. We can see immediately this is going to return back all those post titles. It's going to return our URI. And let's see, what else do we want to add? We probably want like our excerpt to show on the homepage and even our content. And again, since we just added that right on the side here, we get all of that content immediately in those simple GraphQL queries. So let's see what this looks like in practice. I'm going to use my Next.js WordPress starter. Just let me bring this up a little bit. What it's going to do is we're going to go through, and if you're not familiar with a Next.js starter or a Gatsby starter, we're going to run this simple command, and it's going to basically clone down this website as a template. And then we can see here, all we need to do after that is add this one environment file, which is going to set up the endpoint for us. So I'm going to do just that. I'm going to open up my terminal, and I'm going to copy in this command. And let's see, oops, it's already running. But typically I would put the folder name after that, but it's going to give an option for us anyways. So what it's doing now is it's grabbing all those dependencies so it can actually find that starter with Next.js. And let's call it my WP Next.js. That sounds good, right? So what that's going to do is it's going to clone down that template file like I was talking about, but it's also going to install all the dependencies since that's part of the Next.js starter script or the example script in the Next.js world. So now that that's installed, let's cd into my WP Next.js. And I'm going to open that up in my code editor. So before we actually run this in the browser, let's actually poke around a little bit and see what's inside. So if you're familiar with Next.js, it uses file system based routing. So we can see that I already have all these pages in here that you might typically expect from a WordPress site, where the index is going to be your home page. We even have our post list page and we have a search page. But again, the Next.js WordPress starter as is probably a little bit too dense to take into account for this particular demo, but it's totally open source on GitHub if you want to take a look. But what we can do is we can add that .env.local file. And let me grab that snippet from the starter page, where all we need to do is insert this WordPress GraphQL endpoint. And back on my actual WordPress site, if I grab this domain, this host from the front, because this is where I'm currently serving my website from, but what it will do is by default, WP GraphQL will make the /GraphQL endpoint available to query all your GraphQL data. Let me make this HTTPS. So now I have my configuration set up. That's all I needed to do. So let's see what happens when I run yarn dev, which is the starting up a development server with Next.js. I'm going to open this up inside of my browser. I could probably just go to it here. And typical with Next.js, it's going to take a little bit of time to actually compile that first that first site, and it's going to make all those requests to get it from WordPress. But we can already see that it's doing just that. And we're also seeing some extra files in there. One of the cool things about the starter is, in addition to the site itself, we're also creating things like open graph images. While they're simple, it's just a better way to show up on your social feeds. But we're also creating that search index, and we're also creating an RSS feed and a sitemap, because those are all things that we want to make sure that we have inside of our blogs. So now we can see that my new Next.js starter was already set up, and we're going down through these pages, and we can see that that's exactly what we were seeing inside of our WordPress admin. It's a bunch of these the blog posts, and if we click through, again, it'll take a second to load because it's making those requests while it primes the cache. But now we can see that we even have that post page, and it's being dynamically created based off of all that data that we have inside of WordPress. Now we also have like our pages where that's going to automatically be up at the top. We can even configure that if we want with a WordPress menu, if you're familiar with the concept. So it's easier to manage inside the dashboard without having to make any hard coded changes. But we also have the capability of making the searches just like we were talking to that search index. So the search is going to be super fast, which is pretty awesome considering that it's querying all of that WordPress data from your pages. But again, while this is really cool, in my opinion, it has a lot of features. It's just probably a little bit too much to dive into for this particular talk from a technical perspective. So let's spin up our second, sorry, hopefully that didn't make sound. Let's spin up our second WordPress site so we can actually dive into the technical bits. And to do that, I'm going to use this separate starter that I created. And it actually has a name. I have to fix that. But it's basically, I call it a WP GraphQL basic starter, because what it really does is it's going to provide the foundation of all of that, where it's just going to set it up so that we can easily query our post data. It just dumps them on the homepage with the pretty much the default Next.js starter itself, and provides some dynamic page routes. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to copy that command, to open back up my terminal. I'm going to cancel out my other project. Let's level up. I'm going to run that yarn command again, but let's call that my WP GraphQL app. That sounds good to me. So it's going to go through just like it did with the other WordPress, the Next.js WordPress starter. It's going to grab all those dependencies. It's going to clone down that template and do exactly the same thing. So now let's cd into that. Just like before, it's going to have the same configuration that we saw with our other project. So because of that, I'm just going to simply copy and paste that same exact file that we did before. I'm going to create my .env.local, and I'm going to paste in that same exact configuration. Let's see what happens when we spin this one up. That's not the right command. Just like before, it's now going to make our local host ready. I'm going to close that tab and open it up again. And we can see that already it looks kind of similar to the other starter, but this is a lot simpler. And we'll see what that looks like in a second here. But as we can see, just like before, we're actually dumping all these posts inside of the default Next.js WordPress or Next.js starter site. If you're familiar, typically it looks like a few different cards that get added onto that homepage. So really, I'm just dumping the content in there to show a proof of how it works and an example. But just like before, we can navigate to the page. And while it's not the prettiest thing in the world, it's just showing how it works from a basic perspective. So now let's go over to the code and see what that actually looks like. So just like before, it's using the file system based routing that Next.js gives us as part of the Next.js API. So to start off, we have our index.js file, where as we can see here, this is really just a React component, right? So what Next.js is able to do is it provides APIs that wraps React so that we can fetch that data and inject it into our React app. And the way that we're doing this here is if we scroll all the way to the bottom, we're using this function, which is the Next.js API called get static props, where the first thing we do is we're going to get the Apollo client, which the Apollo client is what we're using to actually make requests with the GraphQL API. And once we do, we can see we have this query here that we're simply sending up using the Apollo client, and it's going to send that to that URL that we configured inside of here. And it's going to grab all that post data. It's going to create it as a prop, and even the page settings that we have here, pass them as props into our React component where we can use to build out the API. And we can prove what that looks like. But let me take this query here, and I'm going to go back over to WordPress here for a second, where if I paste this directly in to my graphical playground, we can see the exact data that we're going to get inside of the browser. The first thing, we're going to get that configurable title and the description, but then we can see all that post data, which is exactly what we see on the homepage of our Next.js application. So what we're doing there is we're able to query all that data with GraphQL, which makes it really nice to grab exactly what we want and dump it into our React page. So that's just the home page. Now, for creating those dynamic page routes, we can see here we have this directory called posts, which again, Next.js uses the file system based routing. So what this is first going to do is it's going to create a directory called posts. And then inside of it, we can see this URL or the file name is a little bit strange if you're not familiar with it. Where here we're wrapping that word post slug with brackets. And what that's going to do is it's going to consider that post slug as a parameter or an argument, where it's going to allow that route to be dynamic for us. And the way that it works, I accidentally clicked. So if we look at this file, this looks pretty similar to what we had on our homepage, where honestly, for this basic default starter, we can even see I just cloned the homepage just to provide this as a proof of concept, right? But if we again scroll all the way down to the page, we're actually scrolling past get static props first. We're going to get static paths, which is again another Next.js API. We're similar to before. We're going to grab our Apollo client and we're going to make that request to get all the posts, because in order to create all the paths, we have to know what all posts actually exist, right? So once we grab that, we're able to loop through all of these different posts, and we're going to say for each of them, I want to have a post slug that's going to be available for each of those posts. So that means Next.js is going to go through and it's going to say, for every single one of those slugs, I'm going to send you a parameter so I can help you build a page for every single one. So let's go back up to get static props. So this is where that comes in, where every time it tries to create one of those new pages, it's going to send in that parameter. Where here, we're grabbing that post slug, which is exactly what we had configured for the path. And then we're going to inject that as a variable so that we can get that post by its slug, which we're then able to capture that data similar to what we did on the homepage and inject that as a prop right into our application. Where if we scroll back up, just like before, it's going to allow us to create our UI just like we would in any other React application. But ultimately, this all gets statically compiled. So let's see how that actually works too. Where if I run yarn build, I think I actually, so in my build command, if you want to actually have it statically output. So the way that Next.js works is when you run build, it's going to build it as a Next.js site, which would be all contained inside of this .next.js folder. But if you wanted to actually build it so that it outputs static HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, so that you can deploy it anywhere with static storage, you also need to export the site. So we're going to do that just to show what that looks like. And in our build command, we're going to run next export. So let me build that again, where it's going to go through, it's going to perform that same operation as it did before. We can see that it went through and built those posts just like before, but this time it's going to provide that extra step and it's going to create a static copy of our site. And we can see just that in this out folder, where let me close these so it's a little easier to see. But in this out folder, we can open up our index file and we can see that's just a static HTML file. That's something that we can serve to any browser, and it's going to be super fast out of completely static storage. But ultimately, that's going to give us the same experience right inside of our WordPress site, where we can deploy that anywhere we want, but it's going to give the benefits of being able to manage your content with WordPress, but also the same benefits of being able to deploy that statically anywhere that you want on the web, and it's going to be super lightning fast. So that's the end of my demo. Let me switch back over to the slides. Okay, cool. So Let's recap a little bit about what we achieved here. So we reviewed our starting point, which was a basic WordPress instance. We set up a Next.js WordPress starter. We even set up a second Next.js site with the other basic WordPress starter, and we dug into a little bit of it, and we were able to see how it works. So the goal here wasn't to get you all to jump ship from your current CMS platform and go over to WordPress, but to show the flexibility of it and why it's still a compelling CMS to use along with all the other options available right now. We can come up with some pretty powerful solutions that provide a really great user experience while also making it really performant and cheap. If you want to check out that work, please visit the Next.js WordPress starter on GitHub. It's completely open source. And if you want to learn more about the Jamstack, you can check out my book at jamstackhandbook.com. And that's it. If you want to learn more about anything you've seen here at the talk, you can find me everywhere at Colby Fayok. I'll tweet out a link with everything you've seen here today. Thanks, everybody.